everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk about the dip, but not in a way that you've likely seen or heard before. It's a slight modification to the typical way in which people perform dips, and the reason I wanted to share it was really twofold. One is because I, before doing this variation, just hated dips. I thought dips were trash, terrible, any sort of negative word you want to use. I thought it was that. And I thought that dips just sucked. And then I realized that it was actually my fault and that I was just not using a setup that was appropriate for me. And I think many of you have probably had that experience with dips before, if I had to guess. And the second reason that I wanted to share this is just because I think that there are a lot of valuable biomechanics principles that I'm going to talk about today that you can make use of. All right, so let's jump right in. So first things first, I'll just kind of let things play here so you can see the actual motion, right? So it's basically just a dip as you know it. And the only main difference is that I have my feet anchored on something behind me, right? So in this case, I'm using a bench, but it doesn't have to be a bench behind you. It could be anything sort of similar, right? Just anything that you can sort of put your feet on easily and in an accessible way and in a way that is practical for you. So what is the function first and foremost of having the feet backward this way? Well, in a normal dip, if we go back here, I'll just pause this so we can start to look at some stuff. In a normal dip, the position of the torso and the body, instead of being angled like this, where our, the torso is kind of like this, the legs are like this, the normal situation is such that the body pretty much has to stay, relatively upright, right? So imagine if this is my torso here, that line that I just drew, this line up here, this top blue line, might be the position of the torso in something like a traditional dip without anything behind you. Now, of course, you could sort of crunch yourself forward. People try to do that. And I think that there's a very specific reason for the fact that the more upright version of a dip tends to not feel as good. So let's talk about the actual forces and the muscles involved in this exercise and how it's actually different from a normal dip. So if we look at this bottom position and we want to think about, okay, like what are the forces of this exercise and really what's important to sort of notice about this leaning strategy and how it's different from the normal strategy, is we just start with what are the forces, okay? So obviously there's this dip belt that I have that is just adding load to my body, right? Because some of this contact over here is actually taking load off my body. Right, so I'm not as strong as I may appear. Just for clarity here, you will be quote unquote stronger with this, so you'll be able to use more load than in a regular dip. But again, the solution is just add more load. If we think about the forces, right, the primary force of this exercise is coming through the hands, right? In other words, it's coming from the handles, and my hands are essentially the input for this exercise. And this is the direction of resistance of that exercise. And so in this bottom position, the first thing that you will notice just from a physics perspective is that we can draw a moment arm to the elbow. And if you don't know what a moment arm is, it's basically just a distance that represents how much what we call torque is on a particular joint, which you can just think of as resistance, right? So you see that there's this blue line of force going upward, and you see a red line there to the elbow, and you see a green line there to the shoulder, or roughly where I think the shoulder is. And what this essentially means, green versus red, is that there is much, much more resistance on the shoulder in this case as compared to the elbow, right? So that's difference number one compared to traditional dip, because if you think about a traditional dip, if the torso isn't leaned forward, what ends up happening in essence is this green line gets shorter and this red line gets longer, right? So it ends up being more of a triceps thing. And not only does it end up being more of a triceps thing, but because of the fact that it is less of a shoulder thing, not only are the shoulders less loaded, but because the angle of the trunk is different, the leverages within the shoulder change. Okay, so in simple terms, what that means is that when I am less upright, when I am more bent over in this position, I want you all to notice something very interesting. Okay, so I'm going to draw that force direction again. Again, roughly it's sort of pressing me up and back that way. Let's just very simply ask, okay, what muscles that act on the shoulder are acting most equal and opposite to this direction, right? What muscles, in terms of their fiber direction, would actually oppose that most directly? Well, here is sort of the direction of the lower pecs, which, as many of you might have already assumed, kind of were the things that were going to be most active. And here are the direction of the middle pecs. Now I can't really show you all the direction that the front delts or the upper pecs are pulling just because the angle isn't such that it makes sense to really look at those, right? But the lower pecs, primarily the green arrow, and by the way, the size of the arrows doesn't matter here, I'm just using them to sort of indicate a difference. The green arrow, the lower pec arrow, as you can see, is basically directly in line, parallel and opposite to this blue line. In other words, the lower pecs are in a really, really awesome position to resist the resistance. And the middle pecs, the yellow line here, the yellow arrow, are also in a great position to resist the resistance as well. And when these two things orient more upward, in other words, when the torso is put more upright as in a normal dip without this back support behind the legs, what ends up happening is these two arrows, just picture what would happen. I'll draw a little different thing here so we can illustrate this. Both of these arrows, instead of going in the directions that they're going right here, they would both get sort of turned upward that way, right? Because you can imagine my chest, if I was more upright, would be facing more like these orange arrows. And so what happens is those lower and middle pecs, or really the lower portions of the middle pec, they actually would move out of line, or what we'll call out of the plane of the resistance. In other words, they would be less in line to move us against the resistance. And so those are the sort of underlying biomechanical principles behind why I like to do the lean, and why specifically I think that it is not only just really beneficial from a muscular standpoint. Like when people do dips, they're generally trying to target their lower pecs, right? By and large, in my experience, that's what the stated goal is. And so not only will this make us more specific to your lower pecs because of that fiber direction angle change and how you're able to actually hinge over, but in my personal experience and in the experience of multiple people that have done this, that I've talked to about it, they all pretty much say this feels way, way better on the shoulders as compared to this other version. Now, we're not going to get into potentially why that could be. It just is what it is. A lot of people tend to, in my experience, have shoulder discomfort with dips. And we could get into that, but the short of it is basically just that from a constraints scenario in terms of how much you're able to move, sort of what your shoulders have to do for you to lower and raise yourself when your torso is perfectly upright. It's just much more of a challenge, both in terms of coordination and in terms of the muscles involved and the differences in the muscles involved relative to this kind of dip. So I hope that you all learned something in this video, and I hope that you try this dip out. If you're curious to learn more about these concepts, more about the biomechanics of lifting, check the link in the description where you can access the information to my beginner biomechanics course. If any of you are maybe a little bit confused about what a moment arm is and how I'm determining resistance and just the thought process behind all these things that I'm going over, that will be an awesome, awesome course for you. It's a 30-day course, so you can learn all the material in 30 days or less, more likely less, because all the videos are not that long, although some of them, stretch on to 30 minutes plus. But for the majority of people, I think this will be the best possible starting point to start to learn all this. So check that out in the description below, and I'll see you all in the next video.